thank you so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
Today we have Hans Schuman.
Correct.
Who is the founder of JazzReach,
Yes.
which is a nonprofit that's been around for 30 years.
Correct.
Founded in 1994,
Mm-hmm.
that brings live jazz to young people, primarily, all people,
Right.
but really with a focus on young people. And the nuance here is it's not necessarily teaching jazz, the instrumentation, how to play a trumpet or
Right.
drums necessarily. It's bringing jazz to young people as a metaphor for collaboration, improvisation, listening, all the things that go into performing jazz, but also experiencing jazz. And by witnessing live jazz, young people will be inspired to listen and feel more deeply, right?
Correct.
So you've done this for 30 years.
Yes.
Started out of Brooklyn in 1994. And from what I understand, it all kind of happened when you sold your grandmother's Steinway as capital in the
Right.
beginning. All right, so take us to 1994, this Steinway.
Right.
I'm guessing Grandma maybe left this to you. Was she?
Correct.
All right, she wasn't like,
So-
where the hell did my Steinway go?
Right. No, she was a musician herself. She attended and graduated from Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia.
Oh, cool.
And subsequently taught at that institution for 55 years. And students that attend Curtis Institute are gifted a piano. There's no tuition
wow.
also. And so every student gets a Steinway. And so this was her piano that she received as a student, but subsequently taught on for the duration of her professional career. So this was the piano that was in her apartment.
Okay.
And that I would listen to her give lessons on in the summer times when I would visit her.
Apartment in Brooklyn.
No, in Philadelphia.
Oh, the apartment in Philadelphia.
Yeah, so Curtis
Okay.
Institute is in Philadelphia. So
The
my whole
institute
family,
is, but her home was also in Philadelphia.
yes,
too.
yeah,
Okay.
my whole family's from Philadelphia.
Oh, okay, cool.
I never lived there, but
Okay.
nonetheless, my father and my mother's side are they're all from Philadelphia. So when she passed away, she left me her piano. And I was very conflicted about what to do with it because I had already sort of had this idea of creating a not-for-profit organization. So the germ of what JazzReach was going to be was already sort of in place and set in motion, but I didn't really have any funding or capital to do whatever it was I needed to do. Hire a lawyer to create bylaws and incorporate and get our 501c3 and all these sort of startup costs, get a logo designed, and buy a computer. Et cetera, et cetera. So the piano was being shipped from Philadelphia to Brooklyn. I was living in a brownstone in Boerum Hill at the time. And like I said, I was conflicted about what to do because obviously it had great sentimental value, this piano. And so it was like, but I was on the second and third floor of this brownstone. And so I thought to myself, okay, if the piano movers can get it up the stairs and around the corner and into the apartment itself, perhaps that's a sign that I should keep it.
Okay.
If it doesn't fit, I guess I'm going to have to sell it because I have nowhere to put it.
Fair enough.
Right. So when I watched the piano movers go up the stairs and not make it around the corner, I thought, okay, so
Wow.
I feel a little less guilt. But she was always supportive of me, and my she helped pay for college tuition. She bought my first drum set. So she was always very supportive, and so I wasn't so conflicted about whether or not she would support what the money would go towards. But it was just, the sentimental value of the thing, So anyway, so subsequently I ended up selling the piano, and I had a friend who also lived in a brownstone in Brooklyn, but lived on the first floor with no stoop. So we were able to wheel the piano like directly into their space, and so that's where that was my showroom, was their apartment.
Oh, cool.
So it didn't take very long before this piano, this young family with a small child, this kid who was like probably like 9 or 11 years old, he was like this virtuosic kid.
Oh, really?
They wanted to get him his first like serious piano.
Oh, okay.
And so I felt even better about selling it to them because it was the piano sort of was reborn in the hands of this young prodigy.
Oh, wow.
So that was the story. So then I had the proceeds with which to sort of move forward and start the organization.
Did you learn piano from your grandma? Was she
No.
giving lessons?
No.
Do you play the piano?
Not really.
No.
I mean, I had to take piano lessons when I was a kid, but it never really stuck with me.
Okay, cool. All right, so you sell this piano. And I want to just hear a little bit more. You mentioned that you kind of had the idea for JazzReach or something like it in your head. Why was this idea? What was, the spark? Why was this germinating? Did you understand that this could do something for young people because something like that happened for you? Did you have a young person epiphany?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, I think many of us remember, we don't necessarily remember what we learned in school, but we always remember the field trips. And field trips for me were always really impactful, whether it was a museum or a concert or being taken to a concert hall. Yeah. And so I had those opportunities, and I think more on a subconscious level, I think I wanted to sort of pay it forward in that sense, but that wasn't really the impetus. Yeah, that wasn't really the impetus. So two things happened. I moved to New York in 1990 after graduating from Berklee College of Music, and just like any other young musician, my goal was just to play, play. That's all.
And you're playing the drums?
Yeah, and play. Yeah,
cool.
And so I did that for a while, and as fulfilling as it was, I mean, it was a struggle. Obviously, I'm just a young jazz musician who's just sort of flung myself into the deep end, and trying to survive in New York City.
And are you carrying your kid around? Usually jazz is a smaller kid.
Small kid.
But still,
yeah.
Fred Armisen, the SNL talks about these like lead singers who like roll up to the house microphone, their job's over, and he's got to carry these drums around, and how at one point he got just burned out doing that. He loved playing, but he was so tired of lugging his drum kit around.
That was part of it. I mean, however minor, but yeah, I mean, when you're that young and you're just taking any gig that comes your way, you're generally getting like $75 to $150. If it's a private thing, and maybe you're getting $200. But yeah, I was spending, living in Brooklyn and doing most of this gigging in Manhattan and so forth. I was spending like $50 on cabs just to get the drums to and from the gig. But getting back to sort of what the impetus to start the organization was, I'd been asked to present some music to some students at Brooklyn High School, like downtown Brooklyn High School. I was working for a law firm at the time, sort of part-time, and one of the lawyers was friendly with the principal of this high school and said, hey, the principal would love to bring some musicians into the school. And I was delighted to do it, but and I brought like world-class artists with me. I mean, there's a great pianist named Cyrus Chestnut, and a wonderful bassist who I went to college with, but went on to become one of the most in-demand bassists in jazz. A guy named Dwayne Burno. He was also a dear friend. But I bring these guys into this Brooklyn High School, and the students could not have been less interested.
Interesting.
And this was a music that I was so passionate about, so in love with, and just and so moved by on so many levels that I was a bit struck by how disengaged.
Even once you started playing, or just initially?
Yeah.
Once even in it
playing.
When
we were playing, I was looking around the room, and this sort of like the level of disengagement and apathy really struck me.
Wow.
And I was it hurt. I was not necessarily personally offended, but offended that here we are, offering this music to them, and there was just minimal receptivity. So that in and of itself was sort of struck me, in terms of what can we do? What is it that we weren't doing, or what can we do to elevate the experience or to better contextualize the experience so it resonates on a broader level with the students, or it makes it seem a little bit more relevant to their own experiences. So that was sort of like the real impetus, sort of like what what can I do?
What do you think it was, though? This is in the early 90s.
It's like like 93. So at the time, what was happening culturally was this sort of like the peak of gangster rap, and so you
weren't Dr. Dre,
Right, exactly. Well, no, but that was the thing. I was also really sort of discouraged.
He's not bad on the piano, Dr. Dre.
I'll take your word for it.
He's not Mozart,
right.
But he's got some, All right, sorry.
But no. In any event, obviously there was some concerning messaging in that music, and again, I didn't see it as directly sort of competitive with anything, with jazz or any other genres. But I was sort of acutely aware of the extent to which they weren't necessarily positive messaging. I think any artist has a right to express themselves and tell their story, and whatever that means. But at the same time, generally there were no melodies, there were no harmonies, there were these sort of monotonous drum beats, and then oftentimes you had an MC who was just cursing on the microphone, and not really, by my estimation, not necessarily elevating, the listeners, but certainly relating to the listeners, but that was troublesome too. The extent to which it didn't really reflect the highest levels of artistic excellence as it's defined by jazz musicians or whatever,
or even classical.
Or classical. Yeah, and again, I'm not. They're apples and oranges, and so, but I realized that this was a factor, in that contributed, I think, to to the lack of engagement. In other words, it just didn't. What we were playing didn't sound like what they listened to.
Yeah. Well, by the way, and where you are, I would imagine that grunge rock is not hitting in the same way that rap is, but that you also have Cobain at that point, who's just starting. Mm-hmm. He's coming to the end of his own life, but even rock and roll was going through a sort of transformation. Mm-hmm. And I think, for all young people, I'm thinking about myself. I don't really listen to a lot of rap right now. Respect to rappers and respect to those who love rap. But I was all over the rap when I was young, and I think looking back, it is essentially a version of like punk rock. Now, punk rock purists are going to get mad at me and they're going to say, no, punk rock is punk rock and gangster rap is gangster rap. But what's shared is this, F the police. It's the same as F the man. And I think a young person is caught up in the energy. They're caught up in the taboo. Mom yells at me if I say a bad word. I remember me and my brother had a DMX album. This is a little bit later into the 90s. This is like 96 or something. It was DMX's second album. And there are some rough lyrics in a couple of those tracks. Right. And my mom was pretty lenient. But my brother was cranking one of these tracks, and again, some morbid and intense language, and she finally just came up and she said, "Okay, enough," like where does mom sort of step in? But young people are interested in the exact fact that it's pushing back against these sort of like the proper sort of norms and values to some degree. This is what fuels it. And I think when we grow up, we become a little bit more, conservative and we're looking for those things. Whereas young people, all they want is the rebellion. Right. All they want is that energy.
And that's, and that resonates with me. I tend to resonate with music that has a really high level of urgency and conviction and purity of expression, insofar as like they just, whoever's singing or playing would just as soon be dead rather than not be able to express themselves in whatever medium, So I relate to it in that sense, insofar as that there was an urgency to it. But I think, at the time though, I was very idealistic, as one tends to be in their 20s, and I was very impacted by Wynton Marsalis and his whole platform, which is, that this is a high art form, and this, it represents the highest levels of artistic achievement and virtuosity and nobility, and reflects the most aspirational of our democratic, principles, and so it was very much, there was a very much sort of like a pedestal that I was sort of trying to find some space on, and I guess co-opt to some degree, because I believed in it, and so I don't know that I remain idealistic insofar as I continue to believe in our mission very wholeheartedly, but I think I was probably more judgmental of those other genres of music, and it was sort of like, I've always perceived it to be, sort of nourishment for the soul in the same way that vegetables are nourishment for our bodies, or vegetables or fruit. I've always made these analogies because I find them to be very akin and very analogous to what the arts do for young minds and souls and hearts, and just insofar as just the enrichment component. But so at that time, having had that experience in the Brooklyn High School, also aligned with having read a few books at that time that were really uplifting. I went through a really long sort of James Baldwin phase, and was really impressed by his decision to come back from Paris to participate in the civil rights movement very actively. You know, I think he started to feel quite guilty. He felt like living in Paris, you know, he was celebrated. He was living in an ivory tower, as he would call it. Yeah. And, you know, was basically writing his books and going to parties and so on, you know, but decided, you know, this is something that's calling me, and I feel a need and obligation to be there. And so the idea that he was sort of using his pedestal as a means to sort of shine a light on the movement made an impression on me. And then also I read Arthur Ashe, the tennis player, had recently passed away around that time and wrote his autobiography. It was called State of Grace, if I'm not mistaken. And he talked a lot about using his platform to illuminate things that he saw as injustices or what have you. You know, and you know, I admired the so-called nobility of that. This idea that, like, yes, I play tennis, or yes, I write books, you know, but at the same time, I self-identify as something more than just a writer or a tennis player or just an athlete, you know. And so, you know, as I was sort of thinking ahead with some degree of foresight, like who do I want to be? Who do I want to become? You know, do I just want to be a working jazz musician? Would that satisfy me to the extent of, like, yeah, I'm good, you know, or do I see this cultural void, you know, where young people just had no access to this music that I was so passionate about, that's also, you know, celebrated around the world. So that was really, it was those things. It was the experience at the Brooklyn High School, and it was having read these books by these gentlemen who I had great reverence for, and so I knew nothing of how to run a not-for-profit. I didn't know how to write grants. I had no experience whatsoever. So obviously there was a lot of self-doubt and sort of like, can I do this? But I realized also that, you know, anyone who's working for a not-for-profit arts organization can't be that much smarter than me. You know, maybe I just have to figure it out, you know. So I charted a course and kind of just went day by day.
Well, just going slightly deeper on that, you play for these young people, and they don't really seem engaged. And the model for JazzReach remains playing for young people. So I'm wondering, in having that experience and yourself diving into literature and a sort of deeper mission in terms of engagement, that's sort of reifying this desire of yours to connect and sort of do good, as opposed to just, let's say, entertain or get your own performance ego
cultivate
satiated.
My own talent.
Yeah, which, by the way, that stuff's great too, right? And I'm sure, you know, you and I also believe in just performing and performing live has intrinsic value. But it seems like you dive into an almost intellectual space that kind of reifies feelings you already have. And again, the model remains playing for young people. And I've seen some videos and photos of JazzReach, and the kids seem pretty engaged. Maybe not all of them. Some seem to be finding their way amidst the performance. But I guess what I'm asking is how did you eventually connect? And is it you have to kind of give the kids a different sort of primer? Like, do you have to prime the kids with a preamble of sorts, a preface to say, this performer is important, and here's the history, and not only that, this is how you listen? I just want to give a quick anecdote. I interviewed Marina Abramovich and Igor Levit. Igor is a great young pianist, and they were teaming up to do a performance at the Park Avenue Armory on the Upper East Side. And it really was Igor performing the Goldberg variations, and Marina's role was priming the audience. The notion was, this was even a few years back, not many years back, the notion was that by that point phones had been around, and these are adults for the most part, that people are distracted. And to listen to Goldberg variations from this young prodigy, Igor, who's an amazing guy too, by the way, that you have to kind of be primed. So she made people basically lay on the grand floor of the Park Avenue Armory with like noise canceling headphones in these like lounge chairs for 30 minutes. And 30 minutes in total silence can feel like 3 hours or something like that. But her hypothesis was, and I think this was largely true, is you have to, in a way, force even adults now to get into the proper mind-body space to properly receive this incredible prodigy playing this classic series of music, you know, from heart with this incredible passion and nuance, right? So she was there to prime the audience. It was like, basically, this is how you listen. The peak way, you know, really the decadent way of listening to the Goldberg variations by a great pianist is, I'm going to force you to get into some sort of meditative space, and then finally you can receive this music. And that was a huge lift. And I think Marina, like after 30 minutes, has like a gong in the corner of the Park Avenue Armory, and just like boom, hits the gong, and you kind of wake up, and Igor was basically moving on this like track. The piano was like on a slow moving track across the way. And it was amazing. So anyway, what I'm saying is part of JazzReach, and maybe you should get Marina to kind of shake these kids. Hey, you know, right. But is it about teaching kids?
I'd love to have a staring contest with her.
Yes, good luck. Good luck. Yeah. But is it about teaching kids how to listen, and also why jazz has both historical and immediate human value? Do you basically have to educate the kids first? Was this the missing link? If not, what was the bridge there for you, or what's the bridge now, as opposed to just showing up and playing?
Right. So, I mean, I think the missing piece at the Brooklyn High School was context.
Okay.
Right, and also, I mean, I was young, right? So I really wasn't an experienced speaker, or you know, I didn't really go in with much of a plan. It was sort of like, we're going to play and they're going to dig it, and that's about the extent of it, you know. But I realized that in order to appreciate something, there should be some level of understanding, not entirely, because you don't want to
over intellectualize it or bore the kids.
No, we don't know. No, but I'm sure there are educators who want to tell students how broccoli grows versus just taste this and hopefully, do you like it? You know, So I wanted to be a little bit on both sides of that, you know, insofar as if we contextualize the music and make it relevant to the students, or we present it in a way that's makes it more accessible, then maybe the level of appreciation will be elevated, you know, because again, they've been given the music in a form of contextualization that clarifies, you know, some things that they may not understand if that wasn't present. So, and by contextualization, I mean all of our programs are scripted, right? And I write the scripts. I choose what the subject matter of any given program is going to be, and then I write a script. And then, so all of our programs are narrated live by an actor, right? So I didn't want to be sort of like, we'll go into schools, and then I'll talk, and then I'll put the microphone down, and we'll play, and then I'll pick the microphone up, and then I'll talk some more.
Okay.
I wanted to sort of create productions that maintained a sense of momentum, you know, and moving forward, you know, there was a story being told, and the music was interwoven within the script, and then we have video projections, which help reinforce the narrative.
A little more multimedia.
It's multimedia, and you know, so if there are these sort of visual points of reference that are aligning with what the narrator is talking about, that are then being reinforced by the music that they're hearing, you know, and depending on what the subject matter is, there oftentimes when the narrator says this next song will feature the ensemble playing, you know, this whatever the subject matter, whether it's a program on Miles Davis, or a program on women in jazz, or a program on Latin jazz, or a program on the globalization of jazz, there's often these sort of interludes where the band is featured without narration, just highlight the band and make sure the students get a chance to really hear a performance, you know. Yeah. So it was sort of three elements: the scripted element, the music, and the video projections. That really sort of merged to sort of create the JazzReach experience, if you will. You know, so that's what we do.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Also, you know, I've yet to kind of see one of these experiences live. You had one recently at Lincoln Center
that was
earlier
just a
this
show.
year. Just a show.
That was
it didn't have the multimedia.
No, that was just Dizzy's. That was the quintet. So the all of our artistic programming is carried out by a resident ensemble called Meta Quintet.
Meta with two T's.
Two T's, yes. We're unfortunately not aligned with Mr. Zuckerberg. But nonetheless, Meta. So what we did at Lincoln Center, Jazz at Lincoln Center, was just an evening with Meta Quintet at Dizzy's.
Okay, cool. Yeah. All right, so tell me about, because when I'm hearing that, I have this sort of, I live in the sort of digital age where I kind of want to see one of these, and maybe not everybody can get through the door necessarily to see this transpire live. do you have these archived? Can people engage with these? People who see this, can they go find a multimedia version of what you just described?
We don't have. I mean, obviously, we present our programs on this notion that the music is most at its most potent when it's presented live and you're in person and you're
right, especially jazz
in the same room. So no, we don't. We like our programs aren't available in their entirety online. Over COVID, however, we created an 8-part docuseries, which was educational docuseries. That has yet to be online, but it will be online. But that content really is sort of a supplement to what we do live. And it was, at the time we had nothing else to do but sort of create this digital content. But we also realized that the content in and of itself would be evergreen and would align well as a supplement to what we do live. So insofar as it would assist teachers and classrooms, and it would just be this additional material that could either serve to prepare the kids for a performance, a JazzReach performance, or they could go to it after the performance and dive a little deeper into the subject.
Anybody who's showed up late to something at Lincoln Center and they make you go into the little bleed-off room and you have to watch it on the screen until intermission knows that it just doesn't hit the same that way, does it?
No, it does not.
All right. Well, I kind of want to go back a little bit in terms of just jazz, because, earlier we were talking about, music especially goes through these moments of like new novelty, like even like when Mozart, I'm not just like leaning on, Amadeus, but even he was young and radical in terms of instrumentation and arrangement and these things, where he was bucking up against the establishment, famously in the movie, Too Many Notes, right? All right. So, if you play Mozart for a young kid, he might go, it might take a while to get into it. And, rock and roll, when you have like these early rock and roll, musicians sort of emerging out of blues and yes, emerging out of sort of black culture, right? And getting, picking up the energy a little bit. That was wild. And then even some of the, sometimes even, yes, quality appropriation of that, Elvis is, shaking his hips for that first time, and, the Beatles come to America, or what, this is new, but now if I say rock and roll, people might go, you mean dad rock? And jazz has also dealt with this notion of like, is it cool or is it in fashion, and who's allowed to speak to jazz, the history or its present value, is it mansplained or whitewashed, or all these things, right? On Christmas I went to Blue Note this Christmas and saw Chris Botti playing trumpet, and he had just like an incredible backing band, brought out all these guests. This is Christmas night in New York City. I was so beyond moved throughout the whole thing, and I was like, this feels alive as anything else, right? Or even a little while back, Ron Carter, stand-up bass. This is like one of the most recorded bassists ever. I was right up close. I became friendly with his manager, and the whole time I'm just looking at this guy's hands that have like evolved to play this instrument, and I was so moved. And even hanging out with him backstage, I was like, man, I could listen to that guy all day, and I even thought at the time, I was like, I bet kids would be mesmerized by Ron Carter, just watching him physically and his energy. He has like this wizardly, beyond cool, but a little bit of like a uncle, grandpa kind of warmth to him and ease to him. He made me feel really comfortable. So I just want to acknowledge, after what we said earlier about gangster rap, and by the way, a lot of those guys admitted like they weren't gangsters, you know what I mean? Like they weren't Silver Spoon kids, but they were kind of performing, even Tupac to some degree. This is like, they were kind of playing a role, and even they've admitted it. So I'm not saying those aren't tough dudes, but I'm not saying they weren't performing as these people and effectively, and I would also go as far as to say that even the rap community has since somewhat, not entirely, course corrected in terms of language, in terms of how women are being described, or some of the latent homophobia, or expressed so there's been criticism even within that world. And I remember the same year Jerry Saltz, art critic, won the Pulitzer Prize. So did Kendrick Lamar. And that was Pulitzer stepping out to honor this guy's lyrical content and the dexterity and even the sort of complex instrumentation from track to track. It was very jazzy. I think it was that second Kendrick album. It was
How to Pimp a Butterfly.
Yeah, it really like moved in a very jazzy way.
It's Kamasi Washington
right.
and Robert Glasper.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
I saw Kamashi at the King's Theater.
Right.
It was pretty great.
Yeah.
All right, so anyway, but the point I'm making there is when jazz was emerging, it also had the heat, right? Like it also was kind of bucking up against sort of established norms in terms of like the energy being brought forward. Same thing with rock and roll, right? Like when these new genres or forms, which are evolving, all music is evolving, right? And changing and transmuting. But jazz was that. It was hot and sort of feisty and sort of new, with a lot of intense conversations around it. Thinking of famously Kerouac sort of laying that in through On the Road in terms of like what that meant to be somewhat on the outside of the jazz, but to be right up close, sort of fueling the mad ones, so to speak. Right, or even, La La Land, where you have Gosling sort of waxing on to Emma Stone about jazz and trying to find his way. And trust me, in the media sphere, a lot of people criticizing what was transpiring there. I actually even just interviewed a guy named Lenny Silverberg, who's an old artist living in the Bronx, who has one of the most amazing, famously well-known record collections, jazz and blues. So this guy's like an old jazz head, and he's an amazing guy, and it meant so much to him and still does. So I do think that there is a conversation about like who the music belongs to or where it originated from, but I'm also somebody who thinks music fundamentally is the universal language.
Absolutely.
Right? But for you, and I'm not looking for a full-on take me through the history of jazz lecture, but I saw recently that Coltrane has become somewhat central to JazzReach, the organization, right now, that there's sort of a thematic circling around Coltrane as it stands. Is this correct? You're putting an emphasis on Coltrane
his
recently?
centennial will be next year. And so we saw fit that we should create an educational program that highlights his legacy and his achievements and contributions. So yeah, we're in the early stages of creating a live production that'll feature all these elements that I mentioned earlier. It'll be scripted, it'll have a visual component, and it'll feature a lot of his music from throughout the different phases of his career. Yeah,
and he was a major bridge in terms of like an old school sort of jazz into something a little bit more new school, right? Like from the sort of the 50s.
I mean, he came out. I mean, obviously, he was born in 1925. So obviously he was hearing the artists who would be sort of become his idols, on his instrument, the tenor saxophone. So he was hearing Coleman Hawkins and Ben Webster, and these sort of masters of tenor saxophone within that sort of big band or swing era, But no, he was also listening to Charlie Parker, and was becoming very astute on the language of bebop and what it meant to be an improvising musician, and a creator of music, of improvised music. He was able to be recruited into the band of Miles Davis, which was sort of tremendously nurturing for him, and it sort of just gave him a platform. I mean, he was known as sort of just an obsessive practicer, and the things he was hearing in his head and the things that he wanted to play were always sort of just beyond his reach, So his music often has that searching quality, that sort of like just trying to get to something. To to that higher place, and he after
JazzReach.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, I mean, he just he became with the release of Love Supreme, which is sort of his seminal album. He had become very spiritual, and so subsequently his music was becoming spiritual sounding, and it was intense. So it was for him it was definitely a time and a place. As jazz was evolving and the culture was evolving and all these possibilities were opening up, around that same time, the late 50s, early 60s, and So he was just a product of his time, but at the same time, the music he's created has proven to be timeless. You know, insofar as it's the level of urgency and the level of intensity and just sort of the depth of what he's playing. You know, on a musical level, has not really been transcended. I mean, there are great tenor saxophonists among us, who are playing amazingly, but even they would say that someone like John Coltrane is unsurpassable.
Yeah. I want you to take me to, they're making like a music biopic about your life. And they always have like those cliche scenes of the child where an older sibling or somebody goes, put this record on. It's going to change your life, man. And you mentioned your grandmother.
Right.
But as it pertains to jazz, what was the...
You remember the scene in Jerry Maguire? Where the guy who was going to watch Renee Zellweger's son, Tom Cruise and Renee Zellweger were about to go off and sort of... what would you say?
I don't remember that scene.
Anyway, so they're basically...
It's like a babysitter or somebody? Or?
Yeah, so Tom Cruise and Renee Zellweger are going off on like a work trip or something like that, and
all right.
And the babysitter comes up, pulls Tom Cruise aside and says, "Hey man, I want you to check this out."
Oh, okay.
And he goes on to this whole speech about this is jazz, man.
Oh man, okay.
And, and anyway, so that and then they cut to Tom Cruise and Renee Zellweger in the hotel room, and they're listening to Charles Mingus.
Oh, okay.
And it gets to a point where they're so distracted and disturbed by it, they have to turn it off. anyway, so that pivotal moment for me, like, did I have a pivotal moment?
Did you have something like that? Yeah.
It was gradual, like, because I was a product of the 80s, and I loved rock music, and I had long hair and
nice. Not Flock of Seagulls hair though.
No, I hated that music actually. It's fun. I'll listen to that music now.
I think I did at some no.
Yeah, no, but I'll listen.
My hair naturally does that.
Right. It's funny about the 80s and that time in my life, because obviously it's, all of that music is a soundtrack to my youth.
There's some great 80s music.
Of course there is, but it didn't occur to me then. No, I mean, I like all the new wave stuff and Duran Duran and Flock of Seagulls and like that. I hated that stuff when it was popular, but now I'll listen to it with such sentimentality. I'm just like, this is so great, but only to me. But anyway, no, so I kind of backed into jazz music. I participated in my high school's jazz band, and so I was around a lot of kids who were subsequently playing saxophones, who, because of the instruments they played, they were more inclined to be listening to jazz than I was. So we'd go to each other's houses and play vinyl, and in some cases it would be John Coltrane or it would be Miles Davis, or everything was new to us at that time. So I was still sort of a rock guy, but I was also, like a lot of kids my age, particularly those who played music, sort of like, we were listening to Neil Peart and Rush and Yes and the progressive rock, Genesis and all that. But then you realize that, Chester Thompson, the drummer who's playing in Genesis, also played in Weather Report. Wait, what? Weather what? And then you get into Weather Report, and then you realize that it's Joe Zawinul who played with who? Cannonball Adderley. Oh, Cannonball who?
Yeah.
And then, you had Wayne Shorter in Weather Report who played with who? Miles Davis. And then, so it was this sort of like...
It's like multiple degrees of Kevin Bacon, but Venn diagram.
Yeah, then you realize, and then you sort of go back to like, well, who was Wayne Shorter listening to? And who was Joe Zawinul listening to? And then you'd have like Billy Cobham and all these sort of fusion artists, whether it was Chick Corea, Return to Forever, and you realize that all these musicians were playing with like Stan Getz and Miles and all these people. So it was sort of like, like backing into it, and then once I sort of discovered acoustic sort of mainstream jazz, it was also like I said earlier, that period aligned with the emergence of Wynton Marsalis, who at the time I think was like 20 or 21. He won 2 Grammy Awards. He was the first artist to ever win Grammy Awards for classical and jazz in the same year. Wow. And and he wore suits, and he was refined, and he was well spoken and dignified, and that started resonating with me more than the kid in a concert T-shirt with long hair. And I was like, and it seemed to have a longer shelf life in terms of like a career in music, and also it did represent like greater possibilities on one's instrument. And so that was also coupled with my father, who owned and cooked in his own restaurant. He was encouraging.
This is in Philly?
No, my father lived in Western Massachusetts. This is a whole other story, but he was vice president of the Culinary Institute in the early 70s, and then went to the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts and opened up his own restaurant. So my parents were divorced, but I would spend summers with my father. So
I'm guessing you ate better with Dad.
yes, but it's funny because I never was able to order anything. I mean, I could have ordered whatever I wanted off the menu, but all I ever wanted as a kid was spaghetti and butter, which was more it was more problematic for him because he didn't have pasta on the menu.
Oh,
so
okay.
he had to use a burner to boil water.
Wow,
in the midst of service, he's like,
enough,
oh
fair
God, this
enough,
kid wants he wants a
Those kids still exist out there.
yeah. But anyway, I digress. He said to one of his waiters was a huge jazz fan, music fan, and collector of albums and so forth. And he said, my son Hans is getting into music, but he's just listening to this rock and roll stuff. He's just listening to like Black Sabbath. And he's like, I want to broaden his awareness of other kinds of music. So he had this waiter make some cassettes for me, and they included like Max Roach and Clifford Brown and Elvin Jones and Art Blakey, and so that also sort of helps to broaden just my overall awareness of what was possible on my instrument, because at that time it was just really about my budding love affair with the instrument.
Yeah, and it sounds to me, and I've seen this, is that there's all these different genres of music, and they all have their histories, and they're all connected to like one thread, much like human beings in general. We all kind of go back to a sort of scientific Adam and Eve, and perhaps even, non-scientific, whatever, depending on your perspective on things. We all all music can be traced back, and it's all part of one sort of larger musical family tree, just like we are. But one thing I've realized, and I'm not obsessive about jazz, but I'm generally a kind of all over the place kind of guy in terms of my tastes and likes, but it seems like jazz, more so maybe than any other genre. And I'm sure this argument can be made, and I'd love to have it. But just on my own journeys, and you kind of just described it a little bit, the jazz rabbit hole it seems to be like the best musical rabbit hole in terms of really getting lost. And that despite how visceral it is, especially live and moving live, about feeling, there's like a historical investigative journey one can go on that is kind of obsessive, that it breeds a sort of obsessiveness. Let me tell you, Ozzy, you mentioned Black Sabbath, Ozzy. I kind of came a little later, but of course, any somewhat heavy rock and roll owes it has to pay its dues to Ozzy. And, when Ozzy passed, obviously everybody showed up and understood what a loss that was. But I was never like a super metal kid, although I love it. I'm down. I kind of grew up in the heyday of, coming out of the 80s into the early 90s. I went on that like grunge run harder than ever. Just wearing this flannel is a happy coincidence. Okay. I'm not like, throwing it to the grunge guys, but the conversation about grunge rock can be over in 10 minutes. You can go there, and for me it's really emotional, but you got people emerging out of Seattle, and you could tie that to pushing back against like 80s hair metal. The conversation doesn't.
But you can go back to what Kurt Cobain was listening to.
Well, go on there.
Yeah, I mean, he's a product. He's a distillation of everything he ever heard.
That's true too.
So.
But I'm saying within the genre.
Yeah.
Like if I say grunge rock, there's a limited sort of conversation there to some degree. And yes, of course, like he liked a lot of cool things.
I mean, but yes.
But his genre, there's a container there. There's limits to its jurisdiction.
But then you get into the notion of genre and this idea that it was sort of created for record stores. In other words, it's just a method of categorization. And that, ultimately maybe genre is
and I complain about putting things in boxes too. So I'm not, and this kind of happens at the same time. If I say hair metal, that's painting a very clear picture, right? Like these are guys in leather and spandex with a lot of hairspray, making a very particular kind of music. And to some degree, hair metal is an apt description of the sound and the visuals of a very particular kind of music, right? So it's like, on one hand, we're putting something in a box, and on the other hand, it's like, well,
but then you're dealing with commercial trends, right? I mean,
that's something
which is manufactured.
Okay, and in a way, we're kind of lost in that. Like, I just saw something like, for the first time in a long time, there's no rap music in like the top 40 or something like that for the first time, and we're kind of like lost in like a pop capitalistic hellscape, you know. And I'm not like really getting on T-Swift. I don't want to do that or whatever, but we've kind of like lost that in the 21st century. I mean, even the way the 20th century had these very contained musical decades, and this has been discussed, like for this somehow kind of like ended at the turn of the century. You could argue there was like a rock revival with the Strokes, or there was like a kind of like indie thing that happened with like Arcade Fire and bands like this and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, maybe there was like a wave of new electronic stuff that went a little wild to like dubstep and maybe worse, you know, like, so it's not that new genres or things weren't sort of developing, but I think just the way things were so clearly contained, especially in like most of the 20th century, or at least like the second half of the 20th century, like Boogie Nights, very famously was like, this is the 70s, this is the 80s, right? And people have criticized that too. It wasn't like, you know, the 1980s came and suddenly like disco
but there was
away.
a turning point. I mean, with regard to VHS, if you're talking about Boogie Nights, you know.
Well, that's the
home video and the whole thing. Yeah.
But I'm just trying to say in sort of like music meets fashion, right? Because we're talking about...
Well, everything's a reaction to something, right? I mean,
we were saying that earlier. I guess what I'm saying is jazz. If I say jazz, and now you mentioned, let's say, like a subdivision of jazz. I think you said like acoustic jazz.
Yeah, I mean, which...
You know, I'm sure you could break jazz down into several sort of like subgroup. Maybe that, I don't know if you want to do that, but that could be interesting. Like if I say jazz to you, you could probably create a sort of mosaic of what jazz means. Right. But at the same time, I could say jazz, and all of those things could easily be contained in the same category, on the same stage, in the same show. I mentioned Chris Botti on Christmas. He was all over the place. You know, he had somebody come out. It was much more sort of theatrical. He had somebody who was like a little bit more R&B, you know, had something that was a little bit more bluesy over, you know, so his set largely built around his trumpet playing went everywhere, you know. Or Ron Carter, right, who I mentioned, who's playing the stand-up bass, you know, he's sort of locked into this instrument, but what's happening around him could go anywhere, right? So much like fashion generally, meaning clothing, has its trends, but there's nothing really definitive. I'm looking at young kids, they're wearing like my Jenko jeans from 95. I'm like, those are literally my jeans. How'd you get those? You know what I mean? Like, so we're kind of past this sort of historical categorization into, now we're just in this like soup where it's about some kind of novelty. So it's like, people aren't doing new things necessarily. It's just new people doing those things in a way that's somewhat new. I'm thinking about Ed Sheeran, who won that case for better or worse, where I think Marvin Gaye's estate, I believe, was trying to sue him for copying a riff or something. And Ed Sheeran very famously plays a bunch of riffs within this chord progression where he's saying you can't copyright a chord progression. I remember when people were reviewing Taylor Swift's new album, and I'm like, you're directly ripping off Pixies' Where Is My Mind? Or so where does that end? Like, are we supposed to celebrate you for like brazenly ripping off this famous Pixies jam, like, and putting way worse lyrics on top of it that nobody's, you know, gonna give a shit about in 10 years, right? All right, so I'm jumping around. And this all sort of stemmed out of this notion that jazz is both very complex, it's very wide-ranging, it's been around for many years, it's gone in all these different directions. You could say, you know, you got Coltrane over here, you've got Sun Ra or somebody over, you know, you could draw like a direct line, even Kendrick, right? So it is vast, but there's also something contained about it. And going on that journey, grounding it in JazzReach, I would imagine part of the mission is at least to drop some crumbs, Hansel and Gretel style, in front of young people to go, listen, maybe you don't gotta orient your life around this necessarily, but there's so much to learn here. There's so much history. There's so much culture. There's so many ways you could go just within this thing with these letters, jazz. What is that, and what does that mean, and how do you break through into that? Maybe it's sort of Kendrick, right? Like, or how do you get in? How do you find your way in?
Right.
So what does that mean for you now when you're constructing these new performances, these new multimedia performances? It seems like there is some orientation around Coltrane, being that
it's important, again, going back to the objective in terms of how we wanted to distinguish ourselves from other organizations that maybe had a similar mission. I talked a lot about context, and the contextualization of the music insofar as like what, with regard to presenting it for young people, it's sort of like, okay, this is all well and good, but what does it have to do with me? And our position is this has everything to do with us and who we are as a people, as a culture, as a nation, in terms of, the extent to which the music is representative of who we are and our national identity, in terms of, being diverse and being multicultural, and I often say to people that jazz music has always been reflective of the American experience, so much so now that trying to define what jazz is in this day and age is as difficult or complex as trying to define what an American looks like.
Fair enough.
Right? Mm-hmm. So it's everything and anything, right? But that's not to say that it shouldn't be tethered to its history, because I think for me, that's the thread. In other words, it's the music, any kind of music really, I think its longevity stems from the degree to which the artists were sincere and the extent to which it's whatever they're playing or singing about is representative of the human condition and the universality of the human experience, right? Which never is reliant on trends or fads, so it's not about going from this genre to this person's ripping off a Pixies tune, or, it's just,
you can get a little upset when that happens.
Well, no, I'm just saying, when you drill down and you deal with the objectives, the artistic objectives of any artist who's serious about what they do, regardless of genre, and sincere about what it is they're doing. And there's a level of urgency that's present in most music that remains relevant across decades, across eons, whether it's Bach or Mozart or the Goldberg variations or, Duke Ellington or Miles Davis or John Coltrane or Kendrick Lamar. I think we can I think Kendrick Lamar will likely be studied, for decades to come. And, just in the same way that people are they're studying Nas and, and or Outkast or, some of these artists who sort of transcend genre or transcend whatever era they came out of. The music is the test, in terms of its relevance and perpetuity. For the sake of sharing the music with young audiences on the presumption that this is their first time ever hearing the music, the contextualization is really important. So they have a sense of like, where did this come from? What does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with anything? So again, like we do have a couple of live productions that focus on the history of the music, from the early 20th century through the 90s or present day. And we're always using American and world culture as a backdrop, so to sort of tie in, Miles Davis coming into his own as sort of like the bad boy rebel, with the Ray-Bans and the suits and looking clean and sophisticated, and aligning with what was going on in popular culture. We have like James Dean and, these sort of Hollywood images of rebellious, you have West Side Story and, it's a snapshot of a time and place, but what they did and what they produced transcends that time and place, because of the musical depth of what they, and I think the emotional urgency of what they did.
Yeah, I like that part of the reach is transcendence. And I think this is what we really want from music. You use these two words, and one thing that keeps coming up on this show is authenticity. I think with Taylor Swift, and we're not going to spend all day on Taylor Swift here, and there's a lot of things I like about her, but I think where she got a lot of criticism with this new album is, and everybody's a critic now, and, whatever, they can voice their feelings about the music, some in a more nuanced way. Some people are just fans, and that's okay too. I don't think she's hurting anybody with her music necessarily, but it seems to me that authenticity came under question with this recent thing. Like, is it largely a capitalistic push built on monetary momentum, right? No, she's putting out music and some people might love it, but there seemed to be a conversation about how authentic was this album in terms of what she's saying, how it fits into her life, how it fits into the culture, how it fits into conversations about economics and things like that, right? There's this big conversation swirling around her. A lot of it's real. A lot of it, I think, is a bit overblown and unfair. But I think there's a real conversation about authenticity. And people can create this sort of collective litmus test that runs that meter of authenticity. And it seems like it can sometimes fall a little short when it comes to looking at.
But it's also subjective. Sadly, I think everything's become subjective. Right?
But how many people does it take to create a sort of energy, at least in the moment, right? And that can change, right? How people feel about something in the moment, how they feel about it later. Who knows? Like, looking at Taylor Swift's catalog 20 years from now, they might be like, that one, man, it got a raw deal in the moment.
But yeah, but you're not. But again, it's like the definition of authenticity is subjective. Right? Because some people genuinely believe that a Big Mac is a authentically good hamburger, right? And the McDonald's sales would back it up. Well, yeah, because millions and millions and millions and millions of people are eating it every day, right? In the same way that millions and millions and millions and millions of people are consuming Taylor Swift music, right? Is our Big Macs authentically good cheeseburgers? I would beg to differ. I've had some pretty good cheeseburgers, but you get my point. It's just this idea that if her lyrics are resonating with millions upon millions of women who resonate with whatever she's singing about, then I guess by definition that's authentic insofar as they're authentically moved,
But yes, I'm not throwing Taylor Swift under the bus. Yeah. I think she's providing a safe space for millions of people, a lot of them young women. And she's been around long enough where some of those women are not that young anymore, and that's fine too. But I'm really interested in where subjectivity meets objectivity. When you run an experiment and you have enough variables and
I think time. Getting back to the history of jazz and jazz music, and there's been enough time between now and when Duke Ellington was at his most vital, to know that clearly his music has transcended. And if people are still listening to Joni Mitchell, and in the same way. So
I just watched this Bruce Springsteen movie,
right,
where the whole movie revolves around him making this Nebraska album, which is not his most commercially successful. And people aren't banging those on the jukebox in the bar or whatever. Do people still do that? It's Born to Run, or Born in the USA or whatever, So just that film is about that. Like, what's deeply personal to this artist and what sort of connects commercially at a huge level. These things maybe there's space for both. Okay. All right. Now you got to run. So I'm going to let you out of here soon. And look, jazz is a fascinating conversation, right? Like, you could go anywhere. And I like that it always has, just like jazz, it's got a little tension and a little, and lightness too, I want to just talk about how you had some really interesting people kind of support you in various ways over the years. Just for example, I saw Billy Joel and John Mayer. How do individuals like that fit in, and how can other, let's say, well-known big musicians, not just people who are crushing it in the sort of jazz space where they're not as sort of broadly known, and I'm sure you're making space for them too, and probably incredible musicians, maybe a guy like Questlove or something like that. But with, let's say, Billy Joel or a John Mayer, how have they fit in, and where do you see folks like that fitting in the future?
Well, in the case of those two guys, they've just been contributors to the organization.
Oh, I see.
So I was able to reach them pretty easily just because I knew people who knew either their managers or knew people who knew them, or, and was able to sort of make a case for the organization. And, whereas if I hadn't had any contact with anybody that knew them, I probably wouldn't have access. I mean, believe me, I've tried to reach so many artists who I think would like and appreciate what we do. For one reason or another, they have gatekeepers, and they have people that are like, no, he's not doing, or she's not doing that right now. And so, I look at folks who I believe have some alignment with jazz or have some history with jazz, or, and on a hunch, will do my best to sort of reach out to those people. And in the case of Billy Joel and John Mayer, they were kind enough to accommodate our request.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really that, and that's always the case. I mean, it's with anyone who supports us. It's always hit or miss. I think fundraising is a whole other topic of conversation. with regard to how do you really make a strong, compelling case for what it is you do, to the extent that they're compelled to want to write a check to you, or make a donation or a grant to you. And so much of that has to do with relationship building and meeting people in person and really having these kinds of conversations, where I can really, from my heart make a case. So yeah, we've had people from, the music and entertainment space support us, but in the cases of those folks, it's more or less just been, writing the check, making the contribution. Mm-hmm. It hasn't been sort of like a long period of courtship, asking them to be involved on some sort of programmatic level. I mean, I think in the case of those people in entertainment and music, I mean, their time is far more valuable than their money. So it's much easier for them to tell their business manager to send a check than it is for them to show up somewhere and have to either learn music or have to play or spend an afternoon or go through traffic, So in those cases, it's just easier to sort of appeal to them, for a contribution of some kind.
Well, I'm going to let you go, but let's make an appeal to folks out there who might want to do something like that. 30 years of JazzReach.
A million students.
A million students. That's a million souls.
Yep.
And I would imagine a handful of them might go on to do some jazzy stuff
we hope.
In the future. How do they get in touch with you? Let's say you're a school, you're that exact school. Was that PS?
Well, I should say.
How do they get in touch?
I should say most of our presenting is done through partnerships with performing arts presenters, like concert halls and performing arts centers and things like that.
Okay.
That have the infrastructure in place and relationships with schools in place. So we're more or less brought in to provide programming as part of those venues, educational initiatives in their community. So in other words, we're presented under the umbrella of their educational programming.
Okay.
So that's typically how we do it. We generally don't go into schools. We do on occasion. We have an initiative called JazzReach Up Close, where if a venue just can't afford the stage labor or the school district can't afford buses to come to the venue, we do have this JazzReach Up Close initiative that will bring our ensemble to a school. But that's usually planned and organized by the performing arts venues. That's how our programming is coordinated, through those partnerships.
Oh, cool.
But to support the organization, you can simply just go to our website, which is jazzreach.org, and or get my contact information is on the website as well.
Very cool. All right, last question.
Yes.
If you had to take one album on a desert island, jazz album, amid the vast matrix of jazz, one album, what is it?
I would say the complete Miles Davis recordings on Columbia with his second quintet from 1963 to 67, which includes Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, Tony Williams, and Wayne Shorter.
And a name like Hans Schuman, you swerved classical.
I swear. Well, I do come from that, though. My grandparents, my grandmother and my grandfather on my mother's side were both classical musicians.
Amazing. And it's all up in there, right?
Right.
Hans, I could talk to you forever about
Likewise.
jazz, my man, and you're doing good work. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. All right, man.
Peace. Bye.